Good morning, everyone. How are you all? I hope everyone is keeping well and staying healthy. Students, today we will study about a snapshots chapter Mother's Day, which is written by J.B. Priestley. Student, this is basically a play which was written in 1950 and it talks about the status of women in a society. Or to be more precise, it talks about a mother in her households. But first of all, let us know something about the author. Student author is J.B. Priestley, and he was born on 30th September 1894 in Yorkshire, England, and he died on 14th August 1984. Student, he was an English novelist, playwright, scriptwriter, social commentator, and broadcaster. His Yorkshire background is reflected in much of his fiction, notably in The Good Companions in 1929, which first brought him to wide public notice. Students, many of his plays are structured around a time slip, and he went on to develop a new theory of time with different dimensions that link past, present, and future only. And a student in the University of Bradford awarded Priestley the title of Honorary Doctor of Letters in 1970. So, student, now let us know something about the introduction of the chapter. But first of all, student, let me just tell you the characters of the play. The characters of the play are student number one, Mrs. Annie Pearson, who is the main and prominent character of the play. Then Mr. George Pearson, who is the husband of Mrs. Annie Pearson. Then Miss Doris Pearson, the daughter, and Mr. Cyril Pearson, the son. And the protagonist of the play is Mrs. Fitzgerald, the main prominent character of the play. Right? So let us know the introduction of the chapter. Student, the play written by J.B. Priestley reveals how a mother's efforts are ignored by her family. And students, it narrates how the family members who work 8-hour shifts a day look upon her, although she works for the whole day and all weeks. After all she does for them, they take her for granted. And student, they make her feel obligated, means family members make her feel obligated to provide for them and do not even appreciate her efforts, students. So it revolves around how her friend Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is a fortune teller, you know, helps her earn the place and respect she deserves as the woman of the house. So let us start the story. Student, the story begins with both Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald sitting opposite each other at Mrs. Pearson's place. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a fortune teller, as we know, right? And and she has uh, seen Mrs. Pearson's fortune. Thus, she continues to say that she has told her all that is within her capacity to tell. So she is a kind of, magician lady, sorceress kind of lady. She has learned this magic. So the same reading can work in a positive way if Mrs. Pearson's actions are in sync with it, or it could turn out to be a bad too. So Mrs. Pearson, students, expresses her gratitude towards Mrs. Fitzgerald for having seen her fortune, and students, she shares how great it is to have someone like her around. So she is very submissive lady, very polite. She every time is ready for the service of her family. Mrs. Pearson is very polite, gentle lady. She then asks her, means Mrs. Pearson asks Mrs. Fitzgerald if she has learned the art of fortune telling from the East. Right, so Mrs. Fitzgerald answers that she did learn the art from East for at least 12 years while her father was climbing the ladder to becoming lieutenant quartermaster. The student, she was learning this. So she then motivates Mrs. Pearson to stand for herself and get the respect she deserves at her home. But here Mrs. Pearson replies to Mrs. Fitzgerald's advice by telling her it's far more difficult than it sounds. This is because she loves her family, even if they ignore her needs. She loves to provide for them, even then they are self centered. So Mrs. Fitzgerald wants Mrs. Pearson to realize that it is not that difficult if she really tries. Moreover, she thinks that it would add to their well-being as well if they behaved with love and respect with Mrs. Pearson with her. So Mrs. Pearson agrees with what Mrs. Fitzgerald has to say. Mrs. Fitzgerald says that they need to learn to treat Mrs. Pearson, certainly. She further adds that none of them, neither husband, daughter, and son, have turned out positively as a result of being spoiled by Mrs. Pearson. So, student, she enables her to see how running after them, handling their tantrums, doing all their tasks for them, and staying home while they enjoy every night is harmful for Mrs. Pearson as well as for her family. So, student, she explains how it should be the other way around. The family must treat wives and mothers with full respect and be after them instead of throwing orders. So, student Mrs. Fitzgerald blatantly tells Mrs. Pearson not to act unknown as she is completely aware of the situation. She is saying, I know the story of your house. So do not try to fool me that you are respected in your house. So, student Mrs. Pearson hesitantly says that she often tries to give her and the family clues in between conversation. Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to make her understand that it is high time and Mrs. Pearson's family should respect her now, and that would require more than that clues. So, students, they need to be brought on track. This is what Mrs. Fitzgerald is saying. So now, student Mrs. Pearson understand what Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to say, but she can't stand giving them any discomfort. She wants to clear it out with her family and take her stand, but she just does not know how to take the first step. Just as she is saying this, she notices that it is time for everyone to come back immediately. And immediately, student, what does she do? She gets worried about how nothing is ready for them to come home to, and they will probably have to rush out again. Means after taking something at home, again they will go out, right? So, and nothing is ready in the kitchen. So, student, what does she do? She tries to get up and make arrangement for her family Mrs. Fitzgerald stops her from doing so. Stops her, right? And very easily, students, while lighting another cigarette, she asks Mrs. Pearson to begin at the very moment. She tells her to stop providing for them all the time and let them experience what it feels like to do things on their own only. So don't run after them, she is saying to Mrs. Pearson. Even though in the hearts of hearts, student Mrs. Pearson knows that Mrs. Fitzgerald is right. She tells her that it is almost impossible for her to obey it. She feels that there is no point in giving a promise she won't be able to keep it. So, what happens is she asks Mrs. Pearson to let the hard part and teach Mrs. Pearson's family a lesson. Be strict with them for some time and teach a proper lesson to your family members. She is insisting on this thing. She is insisting on this thing. So Mrs. Pearson tells her that she does not think that it is a good idea. She says so because she knows that they might react to her changed behavior at first. They will react it, but then they would ignore it and resort to their old ways. They means they will come back to their old ways only. So also Mrs. Pearson does not blame them for this. She feels stuck because she knows it needs to be done, but she is unable to do it. So what happens is that she tells Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Mrs. Pearson that she has no idea how successful this idea can be. So Mrs. Pearson thought that Mrs. Fitzgerald wanted to take her place in the house and be strict with her family. So she affirms that she meant the same, but she will not be taking. Mrs. Fitzgerald, assures Mrs. Pearson that she meant the same, but she will not be taking her place as herself. Only she will become Mrs. Pearson and will do her part. This is what she told whom? To Mrs. Pearson. Now, student, as confused she can be at that moment, Mrs. Pearson asks Mrs. Fitzgerald to be a bit more elaborate. So then, student, what she said is that she proposes that they switch their places, or in other words, they will change bodies, wherein Mrs. Fitzgerald will look like Mrs. Pearson and vice versa. A bit more confused and now even surprised, Mrs. Pearson expresses that this is something not possible. So Mrs. Fitzgerald questions her responses by asking Mrs. Pearson if she has ever tried it. How can you say that it is impossible? Quite obviously, Mrs. Pearson had never attempted it. So now, student, what happens is, in a very relaxed tone, Mrs. Fitzgerald tells her that she has tried it before, and even though it has been long, the trick should work. Students, its effect will remain for a short period of time, but enough for them to fulfill their motive. So she, Mrs. Fitzgerald, further added, while holding Mrs. Pearson's hands, that she had acquired the trick from the East. Means this trick she has learned from where? From the East. Still confused, Mrs. Pearson seeks assurance from Mrs. Fitzgerald. Means after some time, after teaching them a proper lesson, to the family members, we will be able to take back in our original forms or not? So she is quite confused. Mrs. Pearson is asking this thing to Mrs. Fitzgerald. Well, Mrs. Fitzgerald makes her aware that she has no other option while holding her hands. She gives Mrs. Pearson a few simple instructions in the process of transmission and says a few words in her mouth. Once she has whispered the spell, both of their bodies become lifeless for a moment while they are still holding each other's hands. As they both came back to life, they try to imitate each other. Now, what happens is, student, Mrs. Fitzgerald is now a bit shy, and Mrs. Pearson has become unafraid only, right? Because now they have changed their personalities. The personalities have now been switched, and with this, the transmission process is complete. While snatching away the cigarette from Mrs. Fitzgerald's hand, who is now Mrs. Pearson, she is confident about the success of her trick. So we will cover up for this part this much only in the first part. The story will continue in the next parts of the videos. Hope you have understood it. Thank you, class.